The first blow wasn't the slap. The first blow was the silence that followed it, a thick, suffocating quiet that swallowed the everyday sounds of the Lindy's diner whole. The hum of the fluorescent lights became a high-pitched whine. The greasy sizzle from the grill vanished. Even the slow, asthmatic wheeze of the old refrigerator behind the counter seemed to stop. All that existed was the sharp, clean crack of palm against cheekbone and the terrible, breathless moment after. Ella Foster's head snapped to the side, a starburst of pain erupting under her skin. The tray in her hands, loaded with 2 heavy platters of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and gravy, wobbled violently. A wave of brown gravy sloshed over the rim of a plate and splattered onto the clean, black-and-white checkered floor. She didn't drop the tray. Her fingers, white-knuckled, clenched the aluminum edge. She didn't make a sound. Her eyes, a striking sea green that people often noticed, but she often hid, simply flooded, the world blurring as her brain scrambled to process the violation. This wasn't happening. Not here, not in her diner. "You deaf, sweetheart?" The man who had struck her leaned across the red vinyl booth. His name, she would later learn, was Vince. He was a mountain of cultivated muscle stuffed into a straining white tank top, a thick gold chain lying against his collarbone. His voice was a low, conversational growl, a stark contrast to the violence he'd just delivered. A smile played on his lips, but it never reached his cold, dark eyes. "I said Diet Coke. This is regular." "Tastes like sugar water. You trying to ruin my diet?" His companion, a blond, similarly built man named Rick, chuckled into his own non-diet soda. "Maybe she likes you, Vince. Wants to keep you happy. Sweet." Vince's eyes never left Ella. She remained frozen, one hand instinctively rising to her throbbing cheek. The uniform, the sky-blue, form-fitting dress with its absurdly deep V-neck that old Pete said added to the ambiance, felt like tissue paper. Her brown hair, neatly pinned under a white paper cap, had a single strand come loose, trembling against her jawline. "Well?" Vince prompted, his voice dropping to a mock-concerned whisper. The entire diner was his audience. The 2 elderly regulars, Sam and Henry, were frozen on their counter stools. Old Pete was a pale, horrified face in the service window, his spatula hanging limp. "You gonna fix it, or do I need to explain it to you again? Maybe you'll learn better with pictures." Before this story goes any further, take a second to subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard in full. They're not just about the explosion. They're about the pressure that builds for years and the reconstruction that can last a lifetime. This was Lindy's, a fixture on the edge of a town that barely registered on most maps. It was a place of warm grease, worn leather, and quiet routines. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the coffee urn, the low murmur of local gossip. These were its rhythms. In one instant, Vince had replaced that rhythm with a solo of pure, unadulterated power. The moral question now hung in the air, heavy as the smell of fried onions. What do you owe yourself when your dignity is stripped from you in public? What is the price of a stand, and what is the deeper cost of surrender? This was the central conflict, born in a sting that echoed in the silence. And no one in that room, especially not the 2 men smirking in booth 3, knew that the universe was already responding. Outside, the gravel of the parking lot crunched under slow, deliberate tires. A dusty SUV pulled into a spot. The driver's door opened, and a man in desert camouflage pants and a tan T-shirt stepped out, a powerful German shepherd moving beside him on a leash. The man looked up at the diner's neon sign, took a slow breath of home, and reached for the door handle. For Ella Foster, the diner wasn't just a job. It was an ecosystem she navigated by muscle, memory, and survival instinct. She knew the exact weight of a full coffee pot. The precise sizzle that signaled a burger was medium rare. The way the morning sun hit the front window at 7:15 a.m., painting the vinyl booths in a temporary, optimistic gold. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, a skill born of necessity, not passion. Lindy's paid the rent on her studio apartment above the hardware store. It covered the prescriptions for her mother, whose health had been slowly failing since Ella's father passed. It asked no questions about the past or about the future. The past and future had a name, Leo. Her brother, 6 years older, was a force of nature who had escaped the gravitational pull of their small town the moment he turned 18. Joining the Navy with a restless fire Ella both admired and feared. He'd become a SEAL. The word was mythical, spoken in hushed tones by their mother with a mixture of terror and pride. For Ella, it meant his presence was reduced to rare, crackling phone calls from impossible places and care packages with exotic stamps that smelled of dust and faraway lands. He was a ghost in camouflage, a story she told sometimes to a skeptical Pete who'd grunt and say, "Sure he is, kid, and I'm the King of England." That very morning before her shift, she'd gotten an email, subject line coming home. Her heart had performed a clumsy, hopeful flip, then immediately clenched with anxiety. Leo was stateside. He had a week of leave. He was driving. He'd be at the diner that evening. "Don't make a fuss," he'd written, his typical understated style. "Just save me a slice of cherry pie and don't let Pete give me any lip." The message was light, but Ella had read it a dozen times, sensing the profound fatigue between the lines, the unspoken weight he always carried but never shared. She'd been floating on that fragile hope all day, which made the violent crash back to Earth so much more devastating. Vince and Rick had swaggered in an hour ago. They were strangers, which was unusual. They had the look of men passing through, maybe for the wind farm construction rumored for the next county over, maybe just trouble looking for a place to happen. They'd been loud, demanding, and dismissive from the start, their commentary on the menu, the decor, and on her, laced with a contempt meant to be heard. The Diet Coke was merely the pretext. She'd brought the drink, her mind already out the door, already picturing Leo's truck kicking up dust on the county road. In her distraction, she'd pulled the wrong handle from the fountain. A simple, human error. She realized it the second she set the fizzing glass down, seeing the faint caramel tint against the ice. "I'm so sorry," she'd said immediately, her voice earnest, reaching for the glass. "My mistake. I'll get you a fresh one right now." That's when Vince's hand had shot out, not to stop her from taking the glass, but to encircle her wrist. His fingers were like steel cables, cool and unyielding. "You already wasted my time," he'd said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "Now you're wasting a perfectly good drink. You drink it." That's when Sam and Henry had turned fully on their stools. That's when Pete's face had appeared, grim, in the service window. The diner had drawn in a collective breath. Ella, her face burning with a humiliation more profound than anger, had tried to gently pull away. "Please, sir, I'll get you a new one. On the house. It won't take a second." Vince had released her wrist. For a fleeting moment she thought the storm had passed. She'd turned, relief a cold wash in her veins, to go to the soda fountain. And then it came. Not from behind, but as she was turning away, a casual backhanded swing that connected with her cheek with a practiced, brutal precision. It wasn't a blow meant to incapacitate, it was meant to erase. To reduce her from a person to a prop in their drama. In the ringing silence that followed, Ella's world telescoped to a pinpoint. She saw the smug satisfaction on Rick's face. She saw the helpless shame in old Pete's eyes. She saw her own reflection, distorted and small, in the chrome napkin dispenser on the table. The hopeful anticipation of seeing Leo curdled into a desperate, sickening prayer. "Please don't let him come now. Please, not like this. Not to see this." The sound of the door chime was obscenely cheerful, a two-tone ding-dong that usually signaled a welcome break in the monotony. Every head in the diner, as if pulled by a single taut string, swiveled toward the sound. A man stood framed in the doorway, backlit by the late afternoon sun. He wasn't exceptionally tall, but he filled the space with a grounded, immovable presence. He wore faded desert camouflage pants and a plain tan t-shirt, the fabric stretched across a chest and shoulders that spoke of relentless functional labor. His face was in shadow under a worn cap, but the line of his jaw was clean and sharp, and by his side, sitting with a posture of perfect discipline, was a German shepherd. The dog's coat was a rich tapestry of tan and black, its ears pricked forward like radar dishes, its eyes, an intelligent, watchful brown, scanning the room with a calm, assessing intensity. It was the dog that registered first for most. Then they saw the contained power in the man's stance. He didn't stride in, he entered, a single fluid step that brought him fully inside, allowing the door to swing shut behind him with a soft sigh. His eyes, a shade of blue so pale it was almost glacial, performed a lightning-fast sweep. They took in the frozen scene at the counter. They lingered on the two men in the booth, their bodies still angled in aggression. And they finally, inevitably, landed on Ella. Ella felt that gaze like a physical touch. She saw the exact millisecond her brother Leo recognized her, and the subsequent terrifying nanosecond his combat-honed brain processed the scene, her hand on her reddening cheek, the spilled food on the floor, the tray trembling in her grip, the triumphant smirks of the men facing her. His expression didn't change. Not a single muscle in his face twitched, but the atmosphere in the diner, already thick with tension, seemed to freeze solid. Vince, momentarily distracted by the newcomer, snorted and turned his attention back to Ella, doubling down on his performance for the new audience. "The crowd's gathering, sweetheart. You gonna finish the show? Maybe some tears? A little apology?" He raised his voice, making sure it carried. "Service in this place is a joke. Can't even get a simple drink order right." Rick laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Needs better training is what she needs." Leo moved. He didn't rush. He walked with a quiet, deliberate pace to the nearest empty booth, two down from Vince and Rick, and slid into the seat facing them. The shepherd followed silently and settled under the table, a shadow with eyes. Leo placed his cap on the vinyl beside him, revealing short-cropped sandy hair, lighter than Ella remembered. He picked up a menu, his movements slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. Ella's breath hitched in her constricted throat. He was here. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical weakness in her limbs, but entwined with it was a new, sharper terror. She knew her brother. This stillness was the most dangerous thing about him. The volcano was never the one making noise, it was the one holding unimaginable pressure in perfect silence. "Ella," Pete's voice, a low, ragged croak, came from the service window. "Orders up for table 4. It was a lifeline, a command to move, to break the spell. She tore her eyes from Leo, who was now calmly perusing the menu as if it were a complex technical schematic. She bent, her movements stiff and robotic, and began cleaning the spilled food from the floor with a wad of napkins, her cheek throbbing in time with her frantic heartbeat. Vince watched her clean, a king amused by a servant's toil. He glanced over at Leo, performing a quick, dismissive assessment. "Soldier boy. Probably some local weekend warrior, a reservist. The dog was a nice prop, he'd give him that." He leaned back, spreading his arms expansively across the back of the booth, claiming the space. "See that, Rick? That's what I call service, making her get on her hands and knees. More places should run like this." Rick, emboldened by his friend and the newcomer's apparent passivity, nodded, a grin splitting his face. "World's gone soft. Everyone's too sensitive. Ella stood up, the soiled napkins a damp, greasy bowl in her hand. She kept her eyes down, a prisoner walking a gauntlet, heading for the trash can behind the counter. As she passed Leo's booth, his hand, resting palm down on the formica table, twitched, just the smallest extension of his index finger. A tiny secret signal from their childhood, used during boring church services or tense family gatherings. I'm here. I see you. She didn't acknowledge it. She disposed of the mess, washed her hands at the small sink, her back to the room. In the warped reflection of the stainless steel backsplash, she saw Pete's worried, wrinkled face. "You want to go take 5, kid? I can cover," he murmured, his voice thick with guilt. She shook her head, the motion causing a fresh wave of pain. If she left now, what would happen? What would they do? What would Leo do? She filled a fresh glass with Diet Coke from the correct fountain, the ice cracking and fizzing loudly in the profound quiet. She carried it, along with a clean napkin, back to Vince's table. She set it down precisely in front of him, her arms steady through sheer, desperate willpower. "Your Diet Coke, sir," she said, her voice a hollow, emotionless monotone. Vince didn't look at the drink. He studied her face at the red mark now blooming into a clear, hand-shaped flush on her cheekbone. He smiled, a genuine one this time, thrilled by the visible proof of his power. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it? But you know, you made a mess. You upset me, wasted my valuable time." He picked up the new glass, took a slow, theatrical sip, and made a show of considering it. It's still not right. Tastes weak, watered down, like your attitude." Ella stood there, a statue of resignation. She was waiting for the next blow, verbal or otherwise. She understood the game's new, terrible rule. The goalposts would keep moving. There was no way to win, only to endure. From 2 booths away, a voice spoke. It was calm, quiet, but it cut through the toxic air like a scalpel. "The cherry pie." Ella flinched. Vince and Rick turned, their expressions annoyed at the interruption. Leo had lowered his menu. He was looking directly at Ella, his eyes soft, focused, as if they were the only 2 people in the universe. "Is it fresh today?" Ella swallowed, her throat dry. "Yes, fresh this morning. I made it myself. I'll have a slice and a black coffee, no sugar, no cream." His gaze held hers for a beat longer, conveying a silent, complex instruction. "Do your job. Come to my station. Get to me." Yes, sir," Ella stammered, the word sir feeling both foreign and utterly appropriately respectful. As she turned to go, Vince slammed his palm flat on the table. The silverware jumped and the glasses rattled. "Hey, we're not done here. I'm talking to you. You look at me when I'm talking to you." Ella froze, caught in the crossfire between 2 opposing forces. Leo slowly turned his head and looked at Vince. Not a glare, not a challenge. It was a look of mild, almost anthropological interest, as if Vince were a curious and slightly unpleasant specimen that had just crawled onto his field of study. He didn't say a word, he just looked. And for the first time, Vince hesitated. The sheer, unnerving neutrality of that gaze was a void his bluster couldn't fill. There was something in those pale eyes that didn't match the soldier boy caricature in his head. It was a flat, assessing gaze that seemed to see everything. The cheap gold chain, the steroid-inflated muscles, the cavernous insecurity festering beneath the bravado, and find it all utterly, boringly insignificant. The standoff lasted only a handful of seconds, but in the heightened reality of the diner, it stretched into an eternity. Vince, physically incapable of backing down in front of Rick, yet deeply unsettled by the quiet man's impenetrable calm, broke the gaze first. He sneered, a feeble attempt to reclaim dominance, and waved a dismissive hand at Ella. "Whatever. Just get out of my sight. You're ruining my appetite." Ella fled to the sanctuary behind the counter. Her hands trembled as she selected the largest slice of cherry pie, the crimson filling oozing seductively onto the white porcelain plate. She poured coffee into a heavy, durable mug. the steam rising in a fragrant, bitter plume. Pete leaned close, his voice a gravelly whisper barely audible over the hammering of her heart. "That's him, ain't it? Your brother?" Ella could only nod, a tight, frantic motion. "Lord have mercy on those two fools," Pete breathed, wiping his hands repeatedly on his grease-stained apron. "He's got that dog with him. That ain't no pet. That's a weapon with a heartbeat." "His name is Rex," Ella whispered, the words sticking in her throat. "He's a working dog, retired." Pete's eyes widened in understanding. He'd seen the news. He knew what that often entailed. He looked from the cool, collected man in the booth to the two blustering bullies, and a strange, grim semblance of a smile touched his lips. "Well," he muttered almost to himself, "this is going to be more educational than a lifetime of Sunday school." Ella carried the pie and coffee to Leo, her steps measured. Setting them down, she allowed herself a real searching look at him. He was thinner than the last time she'd seen him, over 2 years ago at their father's funeral. His face was leaner, harder, etched with new, fine lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into harsh suns and sleepless nights. But his eyes were the same. He gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. "You okay, Elle?" he asked, his voice so low it was merely a vibration in the air between them, meant only for her ears. She gave a tiny, frantic shake of her head, her eyes pleading. "Don't make a scene. Please, just let it be over. Let them leave." He understood. He picked up his fork. "It looks perfect, thanks." She retreated again, busying herself with mechanically refilling Sam and Henry's coffee cups. They were watching the unfolding drama with the rapt attention of men who had seen much of life but were unprepared for this particular scene. Sam, the older of the two, winked at her, a feeble attempt at reassurance. "Pie's on me today, Ella," he said loudly, a small, brave act of solidarity. At their booth, Vince and Rick had returned to their conversation, their voices deliberately loud again, trying to reclaim the narrative, to pretend they were still in control, but the energy had irrevocably shifted. The easy, cruel fun was gone. They were performing now, for an audience of one who wasn't even watching. "Guy thinks he's tough with his attack dog," Rick muttered, just loud enough to carry across the silent room. "Pfft, weekend warrior," Vince replied, stuffing a handful of fries into his mouth, chewing aggressively. "Probably a mechanic, thinks the pants make him special, the dog's for show." Leo took a bite of his pie. He chewed slowly, savoring it as if it were the most important task in the world. He took a sip of his black coffee. His entire being projected a profound, unshakable normalcy. It was a masterpiece of psychological restraint. Under the table, Rex let out a quiet, contented sigh, the sound strangely domestic in the tension. Ella watched from behind the counter, her heart a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. This was the calm before the storm. She knew it in her bones. The question wasn't if the storm would come, but what would trigger it, and what form it would take when it finally broke. Would it be a tempest of brute violence, or something else, something colder and more final? The dread was now laced with a terrible, compelling curiosity. Her brother was home, and he had seen the mark on her face. The story was no longer just hers, it was theirs. Vince called for the check, his voice slicing through the fragile quiet. Ella calculated it with trembling fingers, the numbers blurring on the old register. She placed the slip on a small plastic tray and carried it over, setting it at the very edge of their table, maintaining maximum distance. Vince picked it up, glanced at the total with a snort of derision, and dropped a $50 bill onto the tray. "Keep the change," he announced, his tone dripping with a magnanimous contempt. "For your troubles." The smirk he aimed at Rick was the final insult, a cheap tip meant to be the period at the end of his sentence of dominance, to financially quantify the slap and his amusement. Rick slid out of the booth, chuckling with forced bravado. Vince followed, pushing the table away with his thighs as he stood. a final, unnecessary display of careless strength. They began to swagger toward the door, their backs to the room, already dismissing it from their memory, a story they'd tell later in a bar to laughs and admiration. Leo took one last deliberate sip of his coffee, set the mug down with a soft, definitive clink, and spoke. His voice was still quiet, but it now carried a different quality, not louder, but clearer, more resonant, like a bell struck in the center of a frozen lake. "You forgot something." Vince and Rick stopped mid-stride. They turned slowly, their movements stiff with theatrical annoyance. Vince's expression was one of profound, irritated disbelief. "What did you say?" Leo nodded casually toward their now vacant booth. "Your trash," on the table next to the sticky ketchup bottle and a crumpled straw. Wrapper was the single crumpled paper napkin Vince had used, a tiny, meaningless thing. Rick barked a laugh, a nervous, brittle sound. "Are you for real?" "Dead serious," Leo said, his tone conversational, pedagogical. "You made the mess. You clean it up. It's a basic principle. It's what adults do." The diner inhaled sharply and held it. This was the pivot point, the moment the story could no longer reverse, no longer return to what it was before. It was a direct, unambiguous challenge, deceptively wrapped in the guise of a lesson about tidiness and responsibility. Vince's face darkened, a storm cloud of rage gathering. He took 2 heavy steps back toward the booths, stopping in the no-man's land between Leo and the door. His fists clenched at his sides, the knuckles bulging white. "You looking for a problem, mechanic, huh? You and your mutt want to be heroes?" Leo finally turned in his seat to fully face Vince. He didn't stand up. He remained seated, a posture of disarming, confident ease that was somehow more intimidating than any aggressive stance. "No," he said calmly, as if explaining something to a slow child. "I'm looking for a man who acts like one. I saw you strike a woman who was doing her job. I saw you try to humiliate her for a simple mistake. Now I see you leaving your trash for her to clean up. That's a child's behavior. So I'm giving you a chance to do one grown-up thing today. Pick up your napkin, put it in the bin, and then you can leave." The audacity of the request, the calm, dissecting delivery, left Vince momentarily speechless. His brain, wired for sudden explosions of aggression, couldn't process this slow, steady intellectual pressure. He was a hammer, Leo was a hydraulic press. Or what? Vince finally spat, puffing out his chest, making himself bigger. It was the last weapon in his arsenal. "You and your dog gonna make me? You gonna sick him on me?" Under the table, Rex shifted. A low, rumbling growl vibrated up through the floorboards. So deep it was felt in the bones, more than heard with the ears. It wasn't a frantic, barking threat. It was a warning from the depths of a well-disciplined creature, a sound that promised irreversible professional consequences. The hair on the back of Ella's neck stood up. Leo didn't even glance down. He kept his pale, unwavering eyes locked on Vince. "The or what is simple," Leo said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper that commanded absolute silence to be heard. "You walk out that door having learned nothing. You remain the small, pathetic man you are, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering why people look at you with contempt, never understanding that it's because you never earned respect and never had the courage to try." He tilted his head a fraction, a gesture of cold curiosity. "The napkin is a pretty small, easy place to start building a little character, don't you think?" Chapter 6. The lesson hung in the greasy air, so stark and psychologically accurate. It was humiliating in its own right. Leo wasn't just threatening physical force, he was threatening a mirror. He was holding up a reflection of Vince's deepest insecurities, and Vince was recoiling from the vision. Rick, sensing the tectonic plates of the situation shifting dangerously beneath them, took a clear step toward the exit. "Vince, come on, man, let's just go. This guy's not right in the head, he's a psycho." But Vince was locked in a cage of his own making. Backing down now was an existential impossibility. His entire identity was constructed on the foundation of never backing down. With a guttural snarl of pure, undiluted rage, he bypassed the napkin entirely and took 2 aggressive, pounding strides toward Leo's booth. "I'm gonna teach you a lesson in respect you won't forget, you sanctimonious prick." As Vince moved, Leo moved. It wasn't an attack, it was a simple, fluid, and terrifyingly efficient transition from sitting to standing. One moment he was in the booth, the next he was beside it, facing Vince, his body angled slightly, his hands loose and ready at his sides. The movement consumed no wasted energy, it was pure, applied physics, and it was chilling to witness. Rex emerged from under the table and sat at perfect, statuesque attention by Leo's leg, his eyes now laser-focused on Vince's throat, the growl subsiding into a silent, vibrating tension that was even more threatening. Vince stopped short, his bluster physically smacking into an invisible wall of pure professional readiness. He was a bully who relied on surprising people, on overwhelming them with noise and size and sudden violence. Leo was a monolith of expectation. He expected Vince to charge. He was prepared for it. He had, in fact, already calculated all the possible outcomes of that charge. "The lesson," Leo said, his voice now so quiet it was almost intimate, a terrible secret shared between them, "is already happening. You're just failing it. Here it is. The strength you use to intimidate a waitress is a confession. It screams to everyone exactly what you're most afraid of." Vince blinked, as if physically struck by the words. The verbal shrapnel found its mark deep behind his eyes. His face flushed a deep mottled red. He glanced wildly at Ella, who was standing behind the counter, her hands pressed to her mouth. He saw the old-timers, their expressions no longer helpless but now clear and judgmental. He saw Rick, literally holding the door open, ready to bolt. He was isolated. Truly, for the first time in his adult life, his power, an illusion sustained solely by the fear and compliance of others, had evaporated. This man was not afraid. This man was not complying. With a final, inarticulate sound of rage, shame, and frustration, Vince spun on his heel. He stalked back to his booth, snatched the crumpled napkin off the table as if it were a live coal, stomped to the trash can behind the counter, and slammed it in with unnecessary force. He then turned, his chest heaving, and pointed a trembling finger at Leo. "This ain't over. You hear me? This ain't over." "Yes," Leo said, his tone flat and final, leaving no room for argument or fantasy. "It is." Vince's glare swept over Ella, as if to hurl one last withering threat, but the words died in his throat under the collective, unforgiving gaze of the room. He shoved past a terrified Rick and burst out the door, the bell jangling in a frantic, discordant chorus. Rick scrambled after him like a startled crab. A profound, ringing silence descended, deeper than before, pregnant with a stunned release. Then the violent roar of a truck engine, the scream of tires spinning in gravel, and the fading sound of a vehicle fleeing at high speed. Ella's knees finally buckled. She sank onto a stool behind the counter, a single choked sob escaping her lips. It was over. The storm had broken, not in a cataclysm of violence, but in a retreat born of exposed weakness. She put her face in her hands and wept. Leo's posture softened the moment the door closed. The lethal focus dissolved from his body like ice melting, replaced by a palpable, weary concern. He walked over to the counter, Rex padding calmly beside him, his demeanor shifting from sentinel to companion. He ignored the stunned stares of Sam, Henry, and Pete, his world narrowing solely to his sister. "Elle," he said, his voice gentle now, all the command gone, replaced by a familiar fraternal warmth. "Hey, look at me." She looked up, tears tracing clean lines through the fine layer of kitchen dust on her cheeks. You shouldn't have." "They could have had a knife, a gun." You could have gotten hurt, or you'd have had to." She couldn't finish the thought. "They didn't," he said simply, with a veteran's flat acceptance of facts on the ground. He reached across the Formica counter, his hand, calloused strong yet now gentle, came up and lightly touched her uninjured cheek. "Are you hurt? I mean, besides the obvious." She shook her head, the motion causing more tears to spill. "No, I'm just so ashamed, so embarrassed." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for debate. He looked over at Pete and the two old men, including them in his statement. "Nothing. Do you all hear me? She has nothing to be embarrassed about." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "He's right, Ella. We're the ones who should be ashamed. We just sat here like a couple of potted plants." Pete nodded, his face grim. "I should have come out from behind this counter. I should have done something. I'm sorry, kid. I failed you." Their words were kind, meant to absolve her, but they inadvertently underscored her profound vulnerability. She had been alone in the arena. Leo's arrival hadn't just changed the situation, it had exposed the silent complicity that had allowed it to fester. "Can you leave?" Leo asked, his eyes searching hers. Ella looked at the clock, at the unfinished side work, at Pete. The routine, her armor, her safe prison was in shambles. Pete waved a meaty hand, his eyes wet. "Go, get out of here, take the week, take 2. I'll manage. Doris can come in extra." "Pete, I can't afford to—" "Don't you worry about that," Pete insisted. "Just go, be with your brother." Leo nodded, a gesture of deep respect and thanks to the old cook. He came around the end of the counter, took Ella's apron strings and untied them with a practiced brotherly tug. He lifted the white cap from her head, freeing her brown hair. "Come on, let's go home." Home. The word felt foreign, heavy with new meaning. Her apartment wasn't home, it was a storage unit for her anxiety. Her mother's house was a place of love, but also of duty and quiet despair. But walking out of the diner with Leo beside her, Rex, following a protective half-step behind, felt like crossing a border into a different country. The late afternoon sun was warm and real on her face, washing away the fluorescent pallor of the diner. Leo's truck, a dusty, unremarkable SUV, sat next to her rusty sedan. "Ride with me," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an offer of sanctuary. She got into the passenger seat. Rex leapt gracefully into the back, circled once and lay down with a contented huff. Leo got in, started the engine and pulled onto the 2-lane highway, driving away from Lindy's, away from the scene of the crime. For several miles, they drove in a silence that was not uncomfortable, but thick with unspoken words and shared shock. The tension in Ella's body began a slow, painful uncoiling, replaced by a deep, trembling exhaustion that reached into her marrow. "Who were they?" Leo asked finally, his eyes fixed on the winding road ahead. "I don't know, just men passing through. They'd never been in before." "Does that happen often? The grabbing, the comments?" He couldn't bring himself to say the slap. "No, never like that. Stares sometimes, a creepy comment once in a while. Never physical, never that deliberate." She touched her cheek again, the skin hot and tender beneath her fingertips. Leo's knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel, the only sign of the storm still raging inside him. "I should have been here sooner. I should have come home last month." "You were here exactly when it mattered," she whispered, the truth of it solidifying. Then she looked at him, truly looked, seeing the new lines, the weary set of his shoulders. "Leo, what you did in there, what you said, it wasn't just about scaring them off." He was quiet for a long time, the only sound the hum of the tires on asphalt. "No," he admitted, the word heavy. "It wasn't." "What was it about?" He sighed, a long, slow release of breath that seemed to come from the very core of him. "It was about giving them a choice they didn't give you." Leo didn't take her to her apartment or their mother's house. He drove to a small, secluded county park that bordered the slow-moving Willow River, a place they had spent countless afternoons as kids, skipping stones and dreaming of. Futures that felt infinitely large. He parked under a familiar, sprawling oak, and they got out. Rex immediately began a slow, systematic exploration of the perimeter, his nose to the ground, his body relaxed but his eyes constantly scanning, a professional on a gentle patrol. They sat on a sun-warmed, weathered picnic table, the gentle gurgle of the river providing a natural, calming soundtrack. The midpoint of the story had passed back in the diner. There was no going back to the person Ella was before the slap or the person Leo was before he walked through that door. The confrontation had irrevocably altered their trajectories, bending them toward a new, unknown future. "Tell me about the dog," Ella said, needing to start with something concrete, something outside of the emotional wreckage. A faint, genuine smile touched Leo's lips for the first time. "This is Rex, short for T-Rex, because when he was a puppy, he had these tiny arms and a big head." He gave a soft whistle. Rex's ears pricked and he trotted over, sitting dutifully at Leo's feet. Leo scratched behind the dog's ears. "Best partner I've ever had. Smarter than most people I know. He found an IED on a patrol road outside a village, the kind that was meant for a convoy. He sat. That was the signal. He probably saved 24 lives, mine included." He said it plainly without embellishment. "He's retired now, like me almost." "Almost?" Ella's heart contracted. "You're getting out?" "Medical discharge," he said, tapping the side of his head with one finger. "Not all wounds are on the outside. The docs called it operational stress injury. Needed a reset. Quiet. Routine." He gave a dry, humorless chuckle, looking back down the road toward town. "So I come home to a diner brawl, some reset." Ella absorbed this. Her invincible brother, broken in ways she couldn't see. It made his preternatural calm in the face of Vince's aggression even more awe-inspiring and heartbreaking. That calm was a professional facade, a drilled-in poise over a roiling, troubled sea inside. "What you said to him," she ventured again, circling back to the core of it, "about his strength being a confession. How did you know that? Just by looking at him?" Leo picked up a smooth, flat stone from the ground, turning it over and over in his fingers. "In my line of work, you learn to read micro-expressions, posture, the way someone holds their anger or their fear. That guy, he was a billboard. The chains, the muscles, the performative loudness. People who are truly strong. In here," he tapped his chest over his heart, "don't need to advertise it. They don't need to hit waitresses to feel big." His violence was a scream. He was screaming, "I'm afraid of being invisible. I'm afraid of being a nobody." So he tried to make you feel like a nobody. It's the oldest, saddest power play there is. Ella listened, the lessons sinking in deeper than any simplistic bullies or insecure platitude. This was forensic, psychological, and carried the weight of hard-won, terrible experience. "So you didn't just fight him. You showed him he was insignificant to you," she said, trying to understand his tactics. "I gave him a chance to be significant in a different way," Leo corrected softly. "Pick up the trash. Act like a grown-up. Be a man in the right way for once." It was a tiny open door. He chose not to walk through it. That choice, and everything that flows from it, is on him now. He threw the stone. It skipped once, twice, 3 times across the placid surface of the river before sinking with a soft plop. The world is full of people like that, Elle. They build their fragile kingdoms on other people's sand. My job, for a long time, was about dealing with the ultimate catastrophic expressions of that same sickness. Ideology, tribalism, whatever you want to call it, at its root, it's often the same contempt, the same belief that other people are objects to be used or removed. What I saw today was just a small, ugly, everyday symptom. He looked at her, his pale eyes fierce with protective love. You are not an object. You are Ella Foster. You work 2 jobs. You take care of Mom without complaint. You remember my birthday every year, even when I'm in a place with no address. You are the strongest person I know, because you keep putting one foot in front of the other in a world that keeps asking you to be smaller, to be quieter, to take up less space." His voice cracked just once, betraying the ocean of emotion beneath the still surface. And seeing him put his hands on you, it was like watching someone take a hammer to a masterpiece. Ella broke then. The tears came not in heaving sobs of pain, but in a quiet, relentless river of release. She cried for the humiliation, for the fear, for the years of quiet struggle, for her brother's unseen wounds. Leo put a solid arm around her, pulling her into his side, letting her cry into his shoulder. He didn't shush her. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He just held on, an anchor in her sudden emotional storm. Rex, sensing the shift, came and lay across both their feet, a warm, living weight of pure, uncomplicated loyalty. In that moment, the victim narrative that had begun to wrap around Ella, the helpless waitress, the damsel in distress, began to dissolve. She was being seen, truly seen and valued by her warrior brother, not as a fragile thing to be rescued, but as a fellow survivor of life's harder battles. The real healing and the profound transformation of the story started not with Vince's humiliation, but here, on this picnic table, with Leo's unwavering recognition of her inherent worth. The consequences began to ripple outward the very next morning. Ella's cheek bore a faint, yellowing bruise, a badge of dishonor she wanted to hide but couldn't conceal with makeup. Leo insisted on driving her to the diner. "You don't go back to your battlefield alone the day after," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not ever again." When they walked in, the atmosphere was palpably different. Pete had clearly been talking. The few morning regulars, a trucker named Roy and a school teacher, Mrs. Gable, looked up from their coffee, and their greetings were warmer, tinged with a new, solemn respect. "Morning, Ella. How you feeling?" "That's quite a brother you have there." The support was genuine, but it also subtly cemented her as the central figure in a community drama. Pete wordlessly pushed a large mug of coffee across the counter toward Leo. "On the house. Today, tomorrow, forever, probably." Leo accepted it with a nod. "Just today is plenty, Pete, thank you." Pete leaned in, lowering his voice even though the diner was nearly empty. "Sheriff Dawson was in earlier for his eggs. Heard about the situation. Wanted to know if Ella was planning to press charges." Ella and Leo exchanged a look. The legal system hadn't even entered her shocked mind. "What did you tell him?" Leo asked. "Told him I'd ask." He left his card. Pete slid a crisp business card across the formica. Ella picked it up. Sheriff William Dawson. Pressing charges meant statements, possible court dates, reliving the incident under oath. It also meant holding Vince accountable in the eyes of the law, not just in the court of diner opinion and corporate policy. "It's your call, Elle," Leo said softly, his eyes on hers. 100%. It's your piece. I'll be right beside you for whatever you decide." Before she could form an answer, the door chimed again. A woman in her 50s, dressed in a sharp, professional blazer and slacks that stood out starkly against the diner's folksy decor, entered. She had a kind, intelligent face and carried a leather folio. Her eyes scanned the room and settled on Ella with a compassionate but direct focus. "Ella Foster?" she asked, her voice clear and calm. "Yes?" The woman approached, extending her hand. "Miriam Chase. I'm the regional operations manager for Heartland Eats, the parent company that owns the Lindy's Diner franchise." Ella's stomach dropped. "Owns?" Pete was the owner, wasn't he? Pete's face flushed a deep red. "Now, Miriam, I was going to explain it to her. It's perfectly all right, Pete," Miriam said, her tone gentle but firm. She turned back to Ella. "Pete is our valued franchise operator, but we are the corporate entity. We have a strict, non-negotiable zero-tolerance policy for workplace violence and harassment of any kind. What happened to you yesterday was a gross violation of our company values and, more importantly, of your personal safety and dignity." Ella was speechless, her mind reeling. Corporate policies? Parent companies? Miriam opened her folio. "I'm here first to offer you paid administrative leave with full benefits while we conduct a formal investigation. We will be pursuing charges against those individuals ourselves, utilizing the security footage from this location." She glanced up at a small, discreet dome camera in the corner near the ceiling that Ella had never really noticed before. "We are also initiating an immediate review of safety protocols and de-escalation training for all our franchise locations. What happened to you should never happen to any employee anywhere." She then turned her attention to Leo. "And you are Ella's brother?" Leo gave a slight acknowledging nod. "On behalf of the company, I want to thank you. Your restraint and the manner in which you handled an incendiary situation likely prevented a much more tragic outcome." She handed Ella a formal letter on company letterhead and another business card. "Please take all the time you need. Your job is secure and here for you when and if you are ready to return. Call me personally with any questions at all." After she left, the diner was silent again, but now charged with a new kind of energy. Ella looked at the official letter, then at Pete, who looked deeply ashamed. "I'm sorry, kid," he mumbled, wiping the same spot on the counter over and over. "I should have told you about the corporate buyout last year. They kept me on to run it. I didn't want to worry you with all the paperwork and changes. Felt like it was still my place." The world, Ella realized, was much larger and more interconnected than she'd allowed herself to believe. The incident was no longer a private, shameful moment. It was a corporate case file, a potential legal matter, a catalyst for policy change across a network of restaurants. Leo took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. "Consequences always travel further than the initial action," he said almost to himself. "One act of cruelty, one act of courage. They both send out waves. You never see where all the ripples end." He looked at Ella, his eyes clear. "Your wave, Elle, is just starting to spread." Ella accepted the paid leave. For the first few days she hid from the world. She slept long, dreamless hours. She watched old black-and-white movies with her mother, who fussed over her with a gentle, worried attention. She helped Leo settle into the small, sunlit guest room at her mother's house, the room that had been their father's study. Rex became a gentle, calming fixture, intuitively leaning against the leg of whoever seemed most in need of comfort that hour. But the stillness began to chafe. The physical bruise faded to a faint shadow, but the memory was a fresh, sensitive tattoo on her psyche. She found herself replaying not just the slap, but every microsecond. The cold feel of Vince's fingers on her wrist, the split-second realization of what was coming, the sound, the heat, the silent scream trapped in her throat, the look on the old-timers' faces, the terrifying, beautiful stillness of Leo before he spoke. One afternoon, while Leo was out on a long, contemplative walk with Rex, Ella sat at the worn kitchen table with Sheriff Dawson's card and Miriam Chase's card, placed side by side like tarot cards predicting her future. Her mother, sipping her tea, watched her with wise, tired eyes. "You're thinking about the courthouse," her mother stated softly, not a question. "I don't know, Mom, it sounds so big and exhausting, and what if it doesn't work? What if they get a slick lawyer and make it seem like it was my fault? What if I have to see them again in a room and they're smirking?" "What if you don't?" her mother asked, her voice barely a whisper, "and next month they do it to a young girl at a truck stop somewhere, and she doesn't have a brother like Leo?" It wasn't a guilt trip, it was the presentation of a stark, alternative reality. Ella thought of the next woman, younger perhaps, more alone. working a night shift, with no camera, with no one walking through the door at the right moment. The weight of that possibility settled on her shoulders, heavy and sobering. When Leo returned, his face flushed from the autumn air, Rex panting happily at his heel, she met him in the doorway. "I've decided I want to press charges, and I want to cooperate fully with the corporate investigation." Leo studied her face, reading the resolve that had hardened there. He nodded once. "Okay, then we do it properly. We contact the sheriff. We ask for a victim's advocate. We make sure you have support at every single step. This isn't your burden to carry alone." The process, once initiated, developed its own momentum. Ella gave a formal, videotaped statement to Sheriff Dawson in his quiet office, with Leo a silent, solid presence in a chair against the wall. The security footage from the diner was retrieved and entered into evidence. Watching it from that third-person, grainy, silent perspective was a surreal, out-of-body experience. She saw herself as a stranger, a small, efficient figure in blue, then a statue of shock, then a victim turning away before the blow. She saw the shock wave move through the diner. She saw Leo's entrance, his deliberate calm, the terrifying moment Vince advanced, and the powerful, restrained presence of Rex. The silent video was more damning than any audio recording could have been. The body language was a universal language of aggression and fear. A week later, Miriam Chase called. "Ella, we've positively identified the men. Their vehicle was captured on a state traffic camera 10 miles from the diner. We've traced them to a subcontracting company working on the new wind farm project in Grayson County. We've been in contact with their employer." "And?" Ella asked, her heart pounding. "They've been terminated, effective immediately. Their employer has a strict code of conduct for employees representing them on sites." The video evidence was unequivocal. "They are also fully cooperating with the sheriff's investigation. It appears your brother's assessment was correct. This wasn't an isolated event. There were prior, smaller complaints from other sites about intimidating behavior. They just hadn't been caught on tape." The waves were spreading, faster and further than Ella had imagined. Vince and Rick weren't just facing potential legal consequences, they were facing immediate, tangible professional ones. Their livelihood, built on a certain kind of intimidating, masculine bluster, had evaporated because they'd chosen to wield it against the wrong person in a place with a camera and a corporate policy. Ella felt a strange cocktail of emotions, a sharp, undeniable slice of satisfaction, followed by a deep well of unease. Was this justice, or was it ruin? She posed the question to Leo that evening as they sat on the back porch steps, watching fireflies blink in the gathering dusk. "Justice isn't about feeling good," he said, his gaze fixed on the darkening tree line. "Feeling good is revenge. Justice is about accountability. It's about the system acknowledging a wrong and trying imperfectly to restore balance. They created an imbalance of power, of safety. The law, their job loss, that's society's mechanism trying to swing the pendulum back towards center. It's clunky. It's not perfect. But it's a system. You chose to participate in that system. That's a different kind of courage." "I don't feel courageous," she confessed, wrapping her arms around her knees. "I just feel tired." "Courage isn't a feeling, Elle," he said, echoing his earlier lesson but with a new depth. "It's an action you take despite the feeling. You're taking the actions. That's the only part that history or your own conscience will ever measure." The story, as stories do in small towns, escaped the confines of the sheriff's office and the corporate HR department. The local weekly paper, The Sentinel, ran a front-page story, "Diner Assault Sparks Policy Review, Local Woman's Decision to Press Charges." They quoted Miriam Chase on the company's renewed commitment to employee safety and Sheriff Dawson on the ongoing investigation. They respected Ella's wish for privacy and did not name her, referring to her as a long-time Lindy's employee. But in a town that size, anonymity was a fiction. People at the grocery store, the post office, the library, now looked at her with a new recognition, not with pity, but with a respectful, somber nod. They saw the woman who had stood in the storm, not just the waitress who poured their coffee. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson from the diner found her browsing paint samples in the hardware store. He tipped his faded baseball cap. "Ella, my wife Marge and we haven't been able to stop talking about what happened. We're ashamed. We're two old men who forgot what it means to be men. It's easy to get old and comfortable and think intervening isn't your place. We were wrong." "It's okay, Mr. Henderson, really," she said, touched by his earnestness. "It's not okay," he said firmly, his old eyes sharp. "But we aim to do better. We gave our statements to the sheriff. We told him we'd testify if this thing goes to trial. We were there. We saw it. We're your witnesses for whatever that's worth now." Ella was deeply moved. The silent audience from that day was finding its voice, not for spectacle, but for sober accountability. The community itself was undergoing a subtle recalibration, prompted by the shock of violence in a place of pie and coffee. The incident was becoming a shared reference point for a conversation about decency. Meanwhile, Leo's battle was an internal one. The quiet he was supposed to be cultivating was elusive, a phantom. Ella would wake sometimes in the deep night to hear the soft creak of floorboards as he paced the living room, or see him at dawn, staring out the kitchen window with a 1,000-yard stare, his jaw clenched tight. Rex was his constant shadow, a living, breathing anchor to the present, nudging his hand or leaning against him when the past threatened to pull him under. One night she found him on the porch, his head bowed into his hands, his shoulders hunched. "Leo?" He looked up, and in the dim light his eyes were haunted. "I keep running the scenarios, Elle, all the what-ifs. What if I'd been 5 minutes later? What if they'd had a weapon, and I'd misjudged? What if I'd had to engage in front of you, in that place?" He trailed off, the unthinkable alternatives hanging in the cool air. The protector in him was tormented by the infinite branching paths of possibility where he had failed. "But you weren't late," she said, sitting beside him on the glider. "You were exactly on time." "This time," he whispered, the two words heavy with the memory of other times, in other places, where perhaps people had not been so lucky. She understood then that his war wasn't confined to distant deserts. It was here, in the overwhelming responsibility of care in a chaotic world. His intervention at the diner wasn't an isolated hero moment. It was a single drop in an ocean of potential interventions his mind constantly rehearsed, fears and grieves. "You can't be everywhere, Leo," she said softly, echoing his own wisdom back to him. "You can't stop every bad thing, but you were where it mattered. For me, that has to be enough for right now, for this one night." He looked at her, and a flicker of the big brother she remembered from childhood, the one who built her tree forts and told her silly jokes, shone through the fatigue and the ghosts. "When did you get so damn wise?" "I had a good teacher," she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He just came home." The power dynamics had completed their shift. She was no longer just his little sister to protect. She was becoming his peer, his equal in navigating a complicated world, his anchor in this new, confusing civilian landscape. They were, in the quietest way, healing each other. A formal letter arrived from the county prosecutor's office. Given the clear video evidence, the prior complaints logged by the men's former employer, and their own statements to their lawyer, which characterized the event as horseplay that regrettably escalated, a plea deal was being offered. No jail time, 1 year of supervised probation, mandatory completion of a state-approved anger management and impulse control program, a permanent restraining order barring them from any contact with Ella and from coming within 500 feet of Lindy's diner. Sheriff Dawson came by the house to explain the nuances. A trial is a roll of the dice, Ella. You'd have to take the stand. Their defense attorney would cross-examine you. They might try to suggest you were careless, that you provoked it somehow. The video is strong, but juries, they're unpredictable. This way, they get a criminal record. They get supervised. They stay away from you. It's a guaranteed outcome. Ella felt a hot, righteous flare of anger. No jail, just a stern talking to and some paperwork. It felt insultingly light. Leo, who had been listening quietly, asked, "What's the curriculum of the anger management program?" The sheriff shrugged. Standard stuff, identifying triggers, communication skills, empathy development, taking responsibility. Leo looked at Ella, his expression neutral. "That's the real question you have to answer. Do you want them punished, or do you want them changed? The plea deal is engineered toward forced change. A trial is a gamble for punishment. Neither guarantees their outcome, but each seeks a different one." It was the most profound and difficult question she'd faced. The initial hot desire for punishment cooled as she turned it over. Seeing them in orange jumpsuits might feel satisfying for a day, but would it make them better? Would it fix the sickness Leo had diagnosed, the contempt, the insecurity? "If they actually have to sit in a room," she said slowly, thinking it through aloud, "and listen, and maybe even think about why they did what they did. If there's even a chance one of them actually learns something that might prevent it from happening to someone else. That might do more good than locking them up with people who are just like them." The sheriff nodded, a look of respect in his eyes. "That's the theory behind rehabilitation. Doesn't always take, but it's a chance." Ella took a deep, steadying breath. "I'll accept the plea deal, but on one condition." "What's that?" "I want a letter of apology. Not to me personally, I don't want contact. But I want them to write, in their own words, what they did, why it was wrong, and what they plan to do differently. I don't need to read it. Their probation officer or counselor can read it to verify it's sincere. But they have to sit down and write it." The sheriff looked surprised, then genuinely impressed. "That's highly unconventional. Not typically part of a plea agreement, but given the circumstances, I'll present it to their attorney as a condition of your acceptance." When the sheriff left, Leo put a hand on her shoulder, his pride glowing softly in his eyes. She wasn't just seeking retribution or even just safety. She was seeking a moral reckoning. She was using the leverage she had not to crush them, but to try and force a moment of genuine, uncomfortable reflection. It was a power move rooted not in vengeance, but in a stubborn, hopeful belief in the possibility of growth. Ella returned to work at Lindy's 6 weeks after the incident. The diner had a new, discreet panic button installed under the counter near the coffee station, wired directly to the sheriff's dispatch. A new, mandatory training module on customer de-escalation and reporting harassment had been completed by Pete and all part-time staff. Pete, sobered by the corporate intervention and his own guilt, was a changed manager, more observant, more vocal in his support, quicker to shut down even mild disrespect from customers. Her first shift back, a Tuesday morning, the regulars, Sam, Henry, Roy, Mrs. Gable, gave her a brief, unprompted round of applause that made her face burn with embarrassment. But underneath the embarrassment it felt solid, good. She was not returning as a victim, but as a survivor who had, through her choices, actually changed the place for the better. She was a part of its new history. Leo began volunteering 3 days a week at the county's Veterans Outreach Center, helping with their newly launched service dog training program. Rex was a canine celebrity, a perfect example of a trained partner. The structured work, The focus on patience, command, and care was a potent balm for Leo's restless spirit. He was finding a new purpose in the quiet, methodical act of teaching dogs to help other wounded veterans. The apology letters from Vince and Rick arrived through the prosecutor's office. Ella had the choice to read them or have them filed away unread. She decided to read them, with Leo sitting silently beside her at the kitchen table. Vince's letter was stilted, full of legalese and hollow phrases. My actions were inappropriate and unprofessional. I regret the distress my conduct caused. It read like something copied from a form, but in the final paragraph, a single line hinted at something deeper. My counselor asked me why a wrong soda made me so angry. I didn't have a good answer. I am supposed to be thinking about that. Rick's letter was shorter, less polished, but strangely more authentic. I went along with Vince because he's my friend and I was afraid to look weak in front of him. That's no excuse. I laughed when I should have stopped it. I think about my little sister back in Ohio. I'd kill anyone who treated her like that. I'm sorry I wasn't a better man that day. I'm trying to be now. Ella folded the letters carefully, her fingers steady. They weren't transformative epiphanies. One was a bare beginning, a crack in a thick wall. The other was mired in shame, but that shame had been directed inward, toward his own failure, not outward in more anger. They were starts, reluctant, messy, imperfect starts. Seeds had been planted in hard, barren soil. Growth isn't pretty, Leo said, watching her face. It's ugly and slow, and it usually starts with shame or pain, but it starts. You gave them that starting point. That's more than they offered you. The story, in the way of all stories in tight-knit communities, slowly softened from a raw current event into local legend. Told and retold at supper tables and barber shops, it gained harmless embellishments. Some said Leo had disarmed a hidden knife. Others swore Rex had snarled so fiercely the windows rattled. But the core truth remained, solid and respectable. A woman was assaulted in a place of safety. Her brother stood with a courage that was more psychological than physical, and the world around them was forced to adjust, to look at itself, to do better. Ella enrolled in night classes at the community college, pursuing a certificate in business management. She began to see systems, how they protected, how they failed, how they could be improved. She discovered she had a voice for this, an eye for detail, and a passion born of personal experience. One evening, she and Leo were back at the river. Park. Rex was chasing leaves in the wind, a purely joyful, dog-like abandon in his movements. "What are you going to do when your leave is officially up?" Leo asked. "Back to the diner full-time?" Ella shook her head, watching the water flow steadily onward. "I've been talking to Miriam Chase. They're creating a new regional position, employee safety and support liaison. She asked if I'd be interested in applying. It would involve helping to implement the new protocols, training staff, being a point of contact for employees who have issues. I think I could be good at that. I know what it looks like from the floor. I know what it feels like when the system fails. And I know what it takes to rebuild a sense of safety, piece by piece." Leo smiled, a real, full smile that reached his pale eyes and warmed his whole face. "That's a mission, a good one. Using your pain as a map to help others avoid the same cliffs. What about you?" she asked. "You sticking around here?" He watched Rex barrel joyfully through a pile of leaves. "For a while, the work with the dogs, being here with you and Mom, it's real, it's rooted. The war isn't here. I'm learning how to be here, how to just be." He looked at her, his expression soft. "You helped me with that too, showing me that courage isn't just over there in the dust and the noise. It's right here in pressing charges, in going back to work, in sitting through night classes, in trying to build something better, That's a different kind of service, a lasting one. They sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, two siblings who had each, in their own ways, been to their own personal brinks and back, and had found their way home to a new, deeper understanding of strength, family, and peace. The story that began with a slap in a diner is not, in its heart, a story about a Navy SEAL's vengeance. That was merely the spark, the compelling hook that draws you into a deeper human tapestry. It is a story about echoes. It's about how a single act of casual cruelty echoes through a community, exposing silent fault lines of fear and complacency, and forcing a collective examination of conscience. It's about how an act of profound, restrained courage echoes louder than any shout, teaching lessons about dignity, choice, and the true nature of power. It's about how the ripples of consequence travel from a checkered linoleum floor to a corporate boardroom to a probation officer's desk, changing policies, costing jobs, and altering the course of lives at every level. Ella's bruise faded completely, leaving no physical mark. But the person she became in its wake, a woman who understood her own unshakable worth, who could advocate for herself and for others, who saw both systems and souls with clear, compassionate eyes, that person remained. Leo's private war was not over. It might never be, but he'd found a new front line at home, a battle for internal peace fought with the help of a loyal dog and a sister who refused to let him disappear into his own ghosts. The diner still serves its meatloaf special on Thursdays. The coffee is still strong and bitter. The red vinyl booths are still worn soft by generations of elbows. But the people inside are a little more aware. They make eye contact and say thank you. They speak with a baseline of kindness. They remember, consciously or not, that the person holding the coffee pot is a human being with a story, with battles you know nothing about, and with a resilience that might just surprise you. The world will always have its Vinces and Ricks, people who try to build themselves up by tearing others down, who mistake fear for respect. But it is also full of Leos, people who have seen the worst and choose to use their strength to protect, to teach, and to heal, often with a quiet that is more powerful than any noise. And it is full of Ellas, the quiet, essential people who hold the everyday world together, who discover in a moment of searing trial that they are not who they thought they were. They are stronger, deeper, and more capable of shaping their world than they ever dreamed. Justice, in the end, is not a destination where everyone claps. It is a direction we choose to walk, one difficult, principled step at a time. Growth is not a single event marked by applause. It is a daily, often silent, choice to be better than you were yesterday. This story started with a slap meant to humiliate and silence. But it ends with a conversation, one that continues in diners, in families, in online forums, and in the quiet of our own hearts. A conversation about the price of dignity, the obligation of community, the nature of real strength, and the incredible, enduring resilience of the human spirit. So I'll leave you with this question, not about the characters, but about your own world. From which part of the country are you watching this story? And more importantly, wherever you are, what small, brave echo will you choose to send out into the world today?